I'm Dave Breakenridge, and this is Under the Dome. Alberta Finance Minister Travis Toews dropped his latest budget this week, and it was budget with a capital B. We're talking billions with a capital B, nearly $70 billion in revenue, nearly $70 billion in spending, a multi-billion dollar surplus, $1.5 billion in something called the Alberta Fund, increases in spending for health, education, and more. Makes people wonder, are we going to the polls soon? All that and more today on Under the Dome. My guests today are Edmonton Journal Legislature reporters Lisa Johnson and Matthew Black. Thanks very much for joining me this morning. I know it's been a really busy week for you. It's like Christmas week for political journalists. The Alberta budget was dropped on Tuesday. And before we get into some of the details, I think some of our viewers may be curious to know what budget day is like. And, you know, it's been a little different for the past couple of years. We're not all locked in one big room together. Matthew, just for you, what does budget day consist of?
Yeah, it's a bit like you call the Christmas week. It's a bit like our Super Bowl, isn't it? Like it's around the same time of year, and it's a really long day. I was at the office. I was under the dome around 7 o'clock on Tuesday morning there, and that's when they send the documents out, and it's the start of what becomes a very long 10, 12-hour workday in that you are – I was telling Lisa, it's kind of like an open book test in that you have all of the material in front of you, but you kind of need to know stuff beforehand to figure out the answers and to piece it all together. Around 7 o'clock, they send us an email with 5 files in it that have hundreds of pages worth of budget documents in it. And going through those is a real exercise. And it seems like you have a lot of time because the budget documents are embargoed until about 3 or so in the afternoon. So you think 7 till 3, that's a lot of time. But there's a lot to go through, and a lot happens in between then because you've got a technical briefing with government staff that took about 2 hours on Tuesday, and that's your chance to ask some in-depth questions about what's going on in there, what some of these technical terms means, and kind of just trying to figure things out. And they're your best resource to do that. About an hour after that, around lunchtime, you have an embargoed press conference with the finance minister where you are able to do the same thing on the record and ask him questions about how he pieced this together, what the priorities were, all those types of questions. And before you know it, it's 1 o'clock and you've only got 2 hours to piece all of that together into one or more stories. It's a really long workday. It goes by very quickly. And of course, once your story's out, it's not over yet because then you have to go upstairs into the rotunda, the main floor of the legislature, where all of what we call stakeholders, people who have something to gain or lose from all of these budgets, congregate and want to offer you their opinions. And then you have to work those into rewrites of your stories. So it ended up being pretty close to a 10, 12-hour workday, but it's a lot of fun and it's a real challenge. And as I said, it's kind of like an open book test, but your answers are out in the public and so are all your competitors' answers out in the public. So it's a really interesting dynamic on budget day, one of the best days of the year.
Yeah, it's like a sprint and a marathon all rolled into one. And even at the end of the day, there are still facets of it that we're still teasing out as we get to the end of the week. But I do want to talk about some of the top level numbers, some of the big highlights of this budget. Lisa, it was Finance Minister Travis Toews' latest budget. It was the first under Premier Danielle Smith, and it's shaping up to be the UCP's pre-election budget. It's a kind of a basket of goodies that maybe will hopefully sway voters come this spring's election. So I'm hoping you can give us a bit of an overview, Lisa. How big is this budget, and how did Travis Toews try to sell his budget?
Yeah, there's a lot of money flying around here. And I think also to Matthew's point, the day of the budget, I think a lot of us in the newsroom were a little bit flummoxed at first because most of the big ticket items had already been announced by this government before the budget even came out. You know, billions of dollars for affordability supports, for things for post-secondary students, including a tuition cap in 2024, and there's $243 million of extra funding for primary health care. All of this stuff was announced before the budget. So we were expecting some more big ticket items. There wasn't a lot in compared to the $2.8 billion being spent on affordability supports, but there is still a lot of spending going on in this budget. And even with all that spending, the government managed to post, or the government expects to post, a $2.4 billion surplus in the coming year. And this is with spending cranked up to nearly $70 billion. And of course, all of this relies on oil and gas royalties, which are significant In 2022, that they make up almost half the 2022-23 budget, $27.5 billion, which is a record high, all-time high in Alberta. This coming year, 23-24, that number is expected to be a little bit smaller. It's projected at $18.4 billion. And that, of course, could change literally overnight with any significant change in oil prices, as we've seen many times in Alberta before, right? So Finance Minister Travis Toews has been focusing on the fact that the government is spending on areas that Albertans have told him are important, like healthcare and affordability. He pointed to the UCP's previous kind of fiscal restraint, what we've been seeing during the previous portion of the UCP term, with a lot of reined-in spending, sometimes flatline spending in major ministries. And Toews said that really did the heavy lifting. Those were his exact words for this kind of spending, so that when Albertans need it, and there's, for example, an unprecedented affordability crisis and a healthcare system that's really struggling, they would have the fiscal room to do it. But it's certainly an uncharacteristic budget for him. And you have to wonder if former Premier Jason Kenney would be spending like this, because he never did.
Mm-hmm. And, when it comes to some of these programs that Albertans really seem to care about, I know you mentioned affordability, and there are some affordability measures that were previously announced, but there's always these big ticket items. Health and education always seem to get the bulk of the spending in any provincial budget. Matthew, what did Travis Toews and what did the UCP government promise when it comes to healthcare and education?
Well, health is always one of, and usually the biggest expenditure by a pretty significant margin. It's not really any different this year. We're calling it a record high health budget. There's money for AHS. There's money for primary care. There's money to recruit more doctors. But one theme of this budget that Lisa was just talking about, it was really hard to find things that were actually new. The affordability measures you talked about were announced in November. A lot of the healthcare stuff was announced in the weeks prior to the budget. And it's odd because it's not something governments typically do. They want to kind of reserve all of that surprise and then roll it out all in big budget day like that. So they definitely spent big on healthcare, but it was a lot of it we already knew about beforehand. Regarding education, it's kind of the same story we've heard since Travis Toews' first budget back in 2019, which the province swears it's increasing funding, which it is doing, but advocates will say, yeah, they're increasing funding, but they're not keeping pace with inflation and they're not keeping pace with enrollment. And there was a marked increase in education spending this year, keeping with that big spending theme in the budget, but it just felt like it was another toned down version of that discussion yet again this year.
Mm-hmm. And, we spent hours looking through these budget documents, and there was a lot of things that people might have expected were going to show up in the budget just based on the kind of things that Danielle Smith campaigned on when she was running for leader of the UCP, and even just some of the things that Jason Kenney had talked about in recent years, Alberta pension plan and Alberta police force. Like, what happened with some of those, Lisa? And were there any other things that you may have expected to see in the budget that just weren't there?
Yeah, there were a few things that I think Matthew and I were searching for right away in the main fiscal plan. These are three ideas that the UCP has been talking about for a long time, and all three of them have been controversial in their own special ways, because they're very popular with the UCP base, but a little bit less popular with the general population, right? So we're talking about the idea of a provincial pension plan, for example. That would cost the province money to create its own pension plan, to pull Albertans' money out of the Canadian pension plan. That was nowhere to be seen in this budget. Granted, the Premier Danielle Smith has said at least that the province would hold a referendum on this issue, and that she's planning on releasing some reports that dig into the issue, but we're not going to see those until after the election. And so it remains to be seen what the government is actually planning, if anything, with that after the election. There's also the R-Star program, which has been renamed the Liability Management Incentive Program, I believe. It's a bit of a mouthful. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Dave, on that title. But essentially, it would offer royalty credits to oil and gas companies that clean up inactive wells that are 20 years, haven't been operating for more than 20 years. And Smith says that it's a new idea that's meant to clean up these wells, But of course, a lot of experts on the issue have lambasted the idea because it goes against the whole principle of polluter pay. These companies have a legal obligation to clean up their wells, and so giving them royalty credits, taxpayer money, they say goes against that principle. And then, of course, we've got the Alberta Provincial Police Service, which has long been kind of pushed by the UCP as another way to kind of take control from Ottawa. If we replace the RCMP with our own police service, we can take control over different over the enforcement of laws. But of course, this idea has been studied, has been looked at in detail. The government commissioned a PricewaterhouseCoopers report that showed it would cost hundreds of millions of dollars to set up. It would cost hundreds of millions of dollars more each year to maintain and fund. And generally, with the public that have been polled, it's not a super popular idea. So these are a few of the kind of UCP platform ideas that they've been talking about for years, and a lot of people were expecting, well, if this is going to happen, it's going to happen under Premier Danielle Smith, and we didn't see any of those in the budget.
Yeah, although I will say that I found kind of one thing surprising about this budget, and perhaps it ties into the notion of a provincial police force, but I think the one big surprise out of this budget was this kind of huge cash infusion for justice and policing initiatives, including millions upon millions of dollars for hundreds of new sheriffs. And Matthew, I'm just wondering, how many sheriffs being brought online here? What's the goal with this? And does this signal a government's willingness to move away from the RCMP, or is this separate from that conversation?
Well, the minister insists it's separate from that. They're bringing in 245 new sheriffs based on just over $27 million in funding. And when I spoke to the minister earlier this week, there's still no details on when or where they'll be deployed. But reading between the lines and some of their phrases on this, they're designed to address rural crime. Issues in rural Alberta, which is where they say that they're seeing increasing safety problems, increasing violent crime, to be specific. But a lot of people kind of had that same inclination you kind of alluded to there in the question, like, is this a backdoor way of getting towards an Alberta police force? And there was nothing in the budget, as Lisa said, about that. There's no real mention of it, and the minister continues to insist no final decision has been made. But at the same time, the week before the budget, they announced just around $10 million in funding to the city of Grand Prairie for its own local police force, should they choose to do that. Councillors are going to vote on that in a couple days from now. So while it's maybe not a move towards a provincial police service, it's definitely an effort to weaken the RCMP in Alberta. And the Mounties themselves won't say that, but I talked to the union that represents a lot of the RCMP officers yesterday, and they told me they're quite concerned about that. And if the new officers, these new sheriffs, these new peace officers, will be properly trained and able to deal with a lot of the rural violent crime that they're intended to address. So it's not quite a step technically towards an Alberta police force, but it's certainly Alberta taking more law enforcement into its own hands.
Yeah. Now, among surprises in this budget was the announcement of yet another law banning the government going into the red to fund operations, as well as something that's being called the Alberta Fund. And I'm curious, Lisa, can you break down first how this new piece of legislation banning deficits will work and why Travis Taves says Alberta needs it? And then also what exactly the Alberta Fund will be used for, considering that we have other kind of savings funds. Is it a savings fund, I guess, or is it a way to manage money in a different kind of way?
What is the Alberta Fund? Money for Alberta. It's so let me start with like the overall, they call it the long-term fiscal framework is what they're proposing here. And so the first part, like you mentioned, is making it against the law to run a deficit unless there's some kind of major revenue crisis. And like you alluded to, this has been tried before, but the government has just changed the law to suit itself. So it remains to be seen what kind of teeth that would actually have. But, a reporter asked Taves about this on budget day, what punishment would there be for a government breaking this law? And he said, 100 days in jail, he joked. But essentially he said that, the idea of being publicly shamed for walking back on your promise and not meeting that standard should be enough to incent politicians to absolutely steer clear of any deficit. So that was an interesting point in the fiscal framework plan. It would also cap spending increases each year to inflation and population growth, which the government estimated was about 8.7% in 2022, which is also an interesting measurement because if you compare the spending we saw in the budget to what was forecast in the fall in November, it's a 3.9% increase. So they're safe. They're below that cap. But if you compare it to what was budgeted in February 2022, the original budget under Jason Kenney, it's actually a 10% growth in spending. So it really depends, some would argue, on how you're measuring that spending increase. The fiscal framework would also restrict where a surplus can go in the situation where Alberta is in a surplus. And of course, we're projecting a surplus not just in 23, 24, but the 2 years out from that. So we could be in a surplus situation for a few years more. And so part of this plan would mean that at least 50% of that surplus has to go to debt repayment. There's nothing else you can put that money towards. The other half of the surplus that you have in your general revenue fund at the end of the year would go into something they're calling the Alberta Fund. So right now, this is pegged at $1.4 billion for the fiscal year ending March 31st. So this would be available for the government to play with starting April 1st. So what the Alberta Fund can be used for is either debt repayment, putting money into the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund, or if the government feels like it, they can spend that money on one-time projects, things like capital projects, things that don't incur expenses over the long term, over several years. They're just one-time, one-offs. Right now, the government is projecting that this Alberta Fund will have $1.4 billion in it as of April 1st, and they haven't specifically said what they're going to do with that money. It's up in the air whether or not it's going to go to debt repayment, or if it's going to go to the Heritage Savings Trust Fund, or if it's going to go to some one-time spending in another area that is yet to be announced that we just don't know yet.
So in theory, it could be used as, another $1.5 billion for election spending announced before the election, obviously, because that's the Parliament's legislature. The legislature's on a break during an election, but they could use that to announce some other measure that might potentially garner votes.
Yeah, the opposition NDP has flat out labeled it a slush fund, a pre-election slush fund. Taves says that it's more specifically going to be laid out in the appropriations discussion that goes to the legislature, because of course the government needs to pass its budget in order for it to come into force, and it needs to pass a couple of appropriations bills in order for the budget to be officially enacted. So it remains to be seen if they're going to outline specifically what they're planning on doing with that $1.4 billion.
Yeah. And obviously, as we've talked about, there is an election looming over this budget, over the legislature. How do you suppose that's factored into how the government devised this budget, Matthew?
Oh, it very much is. As we've talked about, it's a big spending budget, but thanks to oil revenue, there's still a sizable surplus, one that's going to continue on for a couple of years to come, projected to in any case. Both parties really focused their budget announcements. I'm talking about the physical location where they were, talking about all of these new things coming out of the budget in Calgary, which is not surprising given the dynamics at work where it's seen as the UCP kind of have a pretty good foothold on rural Alberta. The New Democrats have a pretty good foothold on Edmonton, the capital region, and that leaves kind of Calgary as the decider, so to speak. But if I was to tell you that a party was spending big on healthcare, cost of living, and education, you might think it'd be the one led by Rachel Notley. So this could be viewed as an effort to eat the NDP's lunch, so to speak, to try to capitalize on the policies that they usually take advantage of. And in this case, the UCP can point to their own efforts on that. Though interestingly, there's no one signature piece of infrastructure or policy that they can point to in the years to come that sometimes we see with these budgets. Maybe it's the Alberta Fund, because we're not quite sure what's going to come out of that. But there's no one thing that they can point to, like maybe in 5-10 years and go, that happened in 2023 budget. But the Alberta Fund could still prove to be that. As Lisa said, it's available for use in not very long from now, a couple weeks. And that'll be something to keep a close eye on. I think just how much there will be in that fund and how it will get used in the coming weeks and years.
Yeah. And I mean, talking about the NDP, Lisa, you mentioned that they called the Alberta Fund just another slush fund. I'm wondering, as it is also jockeying for position in advance of a spring election, how does the NDP respond to a budget like this from a Conservative government that isn't necessarily known for big spending? We're seeing some big spending increases, presumably, as Matthew mentioned, trying to eat the NDP's lunch in a city like Calgary, where they'll both be fighting for votes. How does the NDP respond to a budget like this, and what do they say about how the Conservatives are managing Alberta's finances?
So the NDP's kind of been coming at it from a couple different angles. I mean, they've been framing it as a starvation budget and trying to remind Albertans that the UCP has been reining in spending for 3 years and that this has created a deficit. They've estimated that even with this increased spending, with the cuts that we've seen in previous years, things like healthcare and education have still had to deal with, in effect, a cut in their budgets. Mm-hmm. And they've also been trying to remind Albertans that many affordability programs, like the $100 a month affordability checks, will expire right after the election. So for a while, they were using a tagline that was, this represents the most expensive summer ever, which I think also was meant to partly remind Albertans about the Kenney government's preemptive best summer ever celebration. And the other thing that they're doing, too, is focusing on what they call government bloat and increased spending in the Premier's office. We have seen about a 30% increase in spending in the Premier's office. So they're not completely off base on that. They've also been trying to point to some of the spending that the spending decisions that the UCP has made over the past few years and criticizing their priorities, pointing to things like the Keystone XL pipeline, the $1.6 billion that was lost on that, or the millions of dollars that was spent on the war room. So they've been coming at it from a few different angles and arguably also kind of stepping into the Conservative frame, to go back to Matthew's point, because they are, accusing the Conservatives of turning their backs on fiscal conservatism when it suits them and when they have very specific pet projects that they want to fund.
So they're criticizing them for stepping away from conservative values and having bad spending priorities. We're also suggesting that if they were in government, they would spend better and potentially more in areas that matter more.
Yeah, I think the implicit promise is that they would spend more on healthcare and education. They haven't really offered a whole bunch of specific numbers, but they have recently said that they would take a new look at all of these affordability programs and likely restructure them significantly, right? Like we saw the NDP criticizing the $100 checks as leaving behind millions of Albertans because, a lot of people aren't eligible for them. Only, children under 18 and seniors in a certain earnings bracket are eligible for these affordability checks, right? A single person who is 35 years old and is working and is not eligible, of course, even though they might be facing some significant, affordability challenges with the cost of living. So they've already signaled that they would restructure a lot of these affordability programs and put caps on things like utilities and insurance.
Mm-hmm. Well, the lot to cover on budget day. There's still a lot to come as we head into a legislative session and then an election campaign. I know you've got your work cut out for you in the coming months. Lisa, Matthew, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Dave.
And that's it for another episode of Under the Dome. Don't forget you can find all past episodes at edmontonjournal.com/underthedome, or you can hit that subscribe button on YouTube. I'm Dave Breakenridge. We'll see you next time.